back to the live stream. This week we've got Tim Clancy. We're going to be talking about the unfolding situation in the Middle East. We're not going to use ideology, we're going to use science and system dynamics. Yeah, boy, I like that. Be kind, stay safe, and enjoy the show. Welcome back to the live stream. It is October 21st, 2023. This is our 46th live stream, and we are the #1 economic weekly live stream on the internet ever. We've got Tim Clancy today. Hello to everybody in the chat. Make sure you're saying hello. I see 2 people in there. One of them's on the show, so say hello. Let us know you're here, and make sure you're asking questions, and we will cover them. So over the last 2 weeks, we've had the Palestine and Israel situation unfold, and we've kind of touched on it, in brief topics. I've asked, the guests from last week, what his opinion was, what Steve's opinion was, Mike's, Dan's. But we're going to kind of maybe dissect it a little more this week using systems thinking and system dynamics. And we had planned to have Tim back on the show before any of this unfolded in the Middle East. He's got a new paper out. We'll talk about that. But it just kind of worked out. Unfortunately, it's just worked out that he's a guest at this point. So I would say he's our in-house expert at this point. So it's going to be fun. We'll dissect this. I'm sure we're going to piss a lot of people off in the chat because it's a divisive topic. But nonetheless, it should be talked about in an insightful, balanced manner, and that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to bring on Dan first. Here he is. Daniel's always frozen. This is always okay. So Dan's gone. See you later, Dan. We're going to bring on Mike. Mike, here he is. I don't know what's up with his connection of late.
Yeah, the gremlins in the system.
Yeah. Oh, that's too bad. That's too bad. I was, I work up little segments, right? And I plan it, but it's all
That's
fucked up.
Plans.
Yeah, it's completely destroyed. Mike, how was your week?
Oh, it's going well. We got rainy weather today, so no lawn cutting, but more drywalling later today. Personally, we wrapped up our A term for the undergrads. We're starting B term, teaching macro, starting Tuesday. So I'm preparing and updating all my stuff, including some new dynamic simulators for the students. And our graduate program that runs on a semester basis continues along. Our new doctoral students were slowly indoctrinating them correctly into how you build a proper system dynamics model. So that's going well. So all is good.
How to build a proper system dynamic model. I'm still trying to figure that out myself.
Tricky business.
It's tricky. It is. Now, should we try Dan again, or should we just kind of leave him off the show?
Okay, there we go.
Dan, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing really good. Yeah, feel great. Yeah, how about you?
Oh, I'm doing good. I had, last night, I'm pushing 40 now, so it's harder for me to drink my Guinness beers without feeling the after effects the next morning. But I do have to say and declare that all I really ate yesterday afternoon was like 3 McDonald's cheeseburgers with bacon. So the grease was literally leaching through the wax paper, like it was soaking my hands. Like that's supposed to retain
sweating grease.
Yeah. So I have, it definitely, what you eat definitely affects your thinking, your brain. It's and this is a perfect experiment that at least this is what I'm telling my wife. I'm performing experiments so I can, bring it to the Steve and Friends show and explain, you are what you eat. So, yeah. Dan, how was your week?
Pretty good. Doing lots of philosophy, reading lots of books, still avoiding system dynamics on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. Just so everybody knows, Ty is offered multiple times. There's a ton of training videos on how to do system dynamics, but some reason I just don't confront that. I don't know why. It's there.
Well, it's definitely there's a learning curve to it. I'm still in the curve, 5 years into it. I'm still every time I open up either Minsky or VinSim, there's something new. I'm like, well, I really didn't understand that before, and now I do. And I thought I was an expert at this, but I'm not. There's, people like Mike and, others from the System Dynamics Society that have many years ahead of me, right? So there's always something to learn.
And it's a participation sport. You can't just watch lectures on how to do it, like a lecture on how to swim or a lecture on how to drive. At some point, you got to get in the pool, or pull out into traffic, and then that's when you really start to learn.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. For me, I don't know if this goes for you guys, but usually for me, it's in a physical sense, it's picking something up and breaking it or taking it apart and then putting it back together. So some of my best learning came from taking apart some of the big models, the historical models of system dynamics, urban dynamics, world dynamics, and kind of learning that way, versus, and then, so the stuff, let's say the society provides a lot of different links to WPI and whatnot. I always found that was auxiliary information. So once I broke something and I was having a hard time putting it back together, okay, time to go listen to the experts. So that's kind of how I learned myself. But yeah, so let's bring on the man. Is he there? There he is, right there. Steve Keen.
Hey guys, how are you? Paul? All right, I can't. I've had 6 weeks of no weightlifting after getting COVID, so I'm feeling like if I tried to do that, my muscles will hang down rather than up. I'm looking forward to getting back to the gym sometime next month and trying to build a bit of muscle strength back again.
That's okay. When you take your selfies, all you got to do is flip the picture,
turn them upside down. Yeah, that's the old age thing. Yeah, the old weightlifter is the one standing upside down to take his photographs. Right.
Photoshop your head on the top of Mr. Olympia's body.
Well, yeah, the head's doing okay. The body's wasting a bit, but I will try to revive it as of November. We'll see how we go.
So who do we got in the chat here? We got Lana Dell. Welcome back. WWE fan 0104. Michael Radzicki is in the chat. We've got Paul. We've got Chuma Smith. Gus. I haven't seen you before. Welcome. Dan, I was planning on you to start off with the list this week. It's been a while since you've done it. So are you prepared?
I'm prepared. Let's do it.
All right, here we go. Top chatters, commenters from last week.
Ghost on the Half Shell, Wayne McMillan, Tom Crusader, Botched Mandela, Jovian R, Alex Plant, Left to It All, Ryan H, John Lennon, Michael D'Souza Cruz, Brad Atherton, Mark Andrew Demarest, Jimmy, WWE Fan 0104, Philip Burns, Jeremiah Ham, Stefanitza 27, Rock Peletic, J Mills, D Bruce, Apple Scab, Dregai, BMC, Agorithim, Ralph McNally, Nicholas Gomez, Thomas Surdej, Tony Wilson, Stephen Hinton, Bob Liori, Alexandros Tadera, TR Goozer 3000, Manoharan, Amber Griego, Showat, Joe Polito, Lana Dell Hates the Clock, Sherry Wise, the Minstrel 55, Dr. Feelgood, Web Freaks, and David Branch. Okay. Now, Ty was going to say something, but he muted himself.
And I'll say it for him. You left out Alexis Milankovich. Was that the right word? We've lost the Milankovich cycle there.
I skipped over one.
You jumped a name. Yeah. Alexis Romanovich. So getting Alexis gets multiple mention now rather than just one.
Yeah. Thanks, Alex. And still Ty is trying to talk, but he just
more gremlins in the system.
Yeah, it was the five brewskis and the cheesy hamburgers yesterday.
Pushing the wrong buttons.
Yeah, he just needs to. Let me help him out here. Unmute. There we go. Okay, there we go. Ty, go ahead.
Am I muted?
Well, you were muted the whole time, and you were. I don't know what you were talking about, what you were saying, but we didn't hear any word you said.
Okay. Well, that's good. It's because I was just saying, you know me, I just talking shit anyways. So.
Actually, Mike, are you copying wild weather in Boston right now?
Well, it's raining here, but just another rainy Saturday. The grandkids' soccer games are all canceled.
I've seen some footage of pretty dramatic flooding in Boston, I think, just recently. So maybe it's another part of the town.
Not by up. Well, we're in the center of the state. Yeah, no.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So now I just realized I played a bunch of sound effects for Dan, and nobody would have heard them.
That's correct.
Right.
Oh, okay. So here was Dan.
No, but
I was waiting for that when he skipped the name.
I think we were all waiting for it, but it actually felt like even worse because it was just silence.
Okay, so I didn't even actually notice that you missed the name, so I was giving you the air horn, cheers, and applause, so I'm glad nobody heard that because it was undeserved. You skipped a name.
Yeah.
Okay, now it's time to bring on Tim Clancy. Here he is, the man.
Afternoon.
And good evening.
And Tim, yeah.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Let's cover the
bases. Tim, it's been about 4 months since we saw you. How's life been treating you?
Well, it's I've got off camera here to my right a treadmill that when I'm not flying with or meeting a client, I put my laptop on my treadmill, I walk, and you can kind of judge how things are by how much I walk. In the last 10 days, I've probably walked about 250 miles. So it's been interesting times. When you walk, the more you walk and work, the more things are going on. So it's been an interesting 10 to 15 days. Let's put it that way.
Nice. So we've put up. So last time we had links to your consulting website. What's that called again?
Dialectic Simulations.
Yes. So we did that. Now we're doing your other website, your blogging website. It's infomullet.com. And I recall asking you if your mullet was part of your theme last time, and you said no, but I think it is a defining feature that I think we should really point out. We'll just get a bigger picture of that. There he is. Look at those locks. Beautiful stuff going on right there.
He's like Samson. Don't cut him off.
You've got a new paper out. That was the original purpose that we were going to have you on the show. Obviously, things have changed with stuff going on in the Middle East. But let's talk about that paper first. What's it called? What inspired you to write it? Get it published? What's the whole process behind that? And, what was his purpose?
Sure. So this is, the paper is called The Root Cause of Violent Radicalization, the Terror Contagion Hypothesis. And this is something that is probably one of the bellwether efforts of the last 10 years for me. We talked about last time how I came back from Afghanistan late 2012. And probably the initiation of this effort was with the Sandy Hook mass shooting that occurred. And I was on leave at time, and I had just done a bunch of work in counter roadside bomb. And I thought, well, I've got some leave. I'm going to relax and unwind and decompress from this deployment by getting into mass shooting. So I started doing what any autistic neurodivergent would do, and started building my own database and looking at terrorist events like this. And I was surprised that there wasn't a lot of data at that point. This is 2012, but there was a lot of attention on it. And I had just started using system dynamics, and I began looking at these terrorist events. And I'd also been very interested from both overseas work and from Richard Dawkins reading about memetics, how ideas transferred memetics. And Mike will remember very early on in my PhD career at WPI, I came with this idea of evolutionary memetics in competitive environments. And that was my idea. How do ideas spread that may result in terrorism or conflict or things like that? And everyone kind of looked at me like I was crazy and they had no idea what I was talking about, and very wisely moved me on to some other topic. What happened, though, is over time, as I began focusing on violent non-state actors, this question of, we talked last time about ISIS and modeling ISIS and non-state actors and emerging state and the big organizations. And we can talk about that more later in the context. But for this particular paper, I wanted to go into what causes an individual to radicalize to the point they commit a mass shooting or a terrorist attack or something like that. And so I began working on this paper, and it's been probably 7 years that I've been working on it to build a system structure of radicalization, beginning with this concept of, is it bottom-up swarm effect, local folks, or top-down non-state actors, and really realizing that we had to take a systems thinking approach, broaden the boundaries, and create this larger system. And within that, I found, surprising to me, that there was this concept of transfer of ideas, memetics, cultural scripts that were driving this. And one thing led to another. And we came up with this idea that was to create a system structure of violent radicalization, and then really explore it and say, within this, what causes these individual acts? And that's how we came up with the terror contagion hypothesis, which can I explain. But this has been throughout a thread throughout the dissertation. And as people know, with academic publishing, it never comes out in order. There are 4 papers on this, one of which is the simulation. It's been published for 2 years, but this one, the root causes, is sort of the theoretical foundation, the real key thing in my mind of the hypothesis and a lot of the experiments and tests we put out there to build confidence in it. So I was really pleased it was coming out, and I was getting ready to do all these great talks. I'm going to be on 5 shows in the next week and a half to talk about this, and every single one has switched topics on me. So it's kind of, you roll with the punches, but it's I'm pleased it's out. It was co-authored by Khalid Saeed, Oleg Pavlov, and Bland Addison at WPI. And I'm happy it's out there. It's one of those things that if you work on something for 7 to 8 years, just getting it out in the open air is a good feeling.
Nice. So tell me, what is the process? What is the process of getting a paper published on, like, within an academic journal? Like, how does that, I'm not an academic, right? So I've heard things, like from Steve, the problem of getting it refereed and stuff. What is that process? There's probably a lot of viewers that definitely haven't put out an academic paper. What is that process like?
It's very different, first of all, from any other publication. I've written things before. I have a blog that probably has 1,000 posts on it. When we say publishing an article, the first thought is it's like in magazine. But publishing an academic article is a much more intensive, long-term process. So the first thing you really need to do is you need to understand the landscape. What are the journals out there that may be interested in what you are talking about? And you have to find a journal that's going to know how to handle your topic. And for something like violence and instability, there's a set of journals around that. But yet in system dynamics and systems thinking, it's very unusual in that field to use that. It's a very new development. And so you have to find the journals that do it. Then you have to work through the iterations of your paper. You get it reviewed internally. You submit it. You get rejected dozens of times because the journal says this isn't a fit. We don't like systems thinking diagrams. We don't like simulations. And that's okay. The big thing throughout this is to never let a rejection set you back. It's just pivot you to the next one and keep working. Once you find a journal that is willing to accept it and start the process can then take a year or longer as you assemble these peer reviewers. And there is a great amount of jokes. There's usually 3 reviewers, but it's reviewer number 2 that you got to watch out for. There's always that one reviewer who's gunning for you. But then these peer reviewers are trying to improve the article, challenge your assertions, make it better. And the article you start out with can end up being very, very different based on the evolution of this interaction. And it's really hard sometimes. We're personally invested in this, and you get someone throwing stones at you. You got to kind of pick what things you're willing to say that's a good idea, we can incorporate it there, what you're going to stand firm on, and risk the paper being rejected and then starting all over. Now, the big thing in academic publishing, rejection itself isn't a bad deal. Like, that's part of the process. It's much better to have a paper rejected than it is to have it retracted. Retracted is, if there's some sort of fraud or something, that's different. But if a paper gets rejected, you go and you say, well, is that something we can improve on? So with this particular paper, dealing with violent radicalization, dealing with mass shootings. Remember, when we started this, there wasn't even a connection that mass shootings were considered terrorism. That was something that came about over the time we were doing this. And then adding to it systems thinking and simulations. A lot of effort took to get to find the right home for it, which eventually became the system dynamics review. But that was not the first place we tried to do it. We were trying to get published in some of the terrorism journals and the radicalization journals. And they were very interested in the topic, but the systems thinking part and the system dynamics was not a fit to their users. And we made a choice to say, as the foundational piece of the theory, this is absolutely vital for what we're doing, and we can't sacrifice that part. So we held on to it until we could find a home for it, and then go through the reviews and go through that. So that's kind of the overview of the process. It's anyone who's published knows it's a long, complicated, grueling process that is not the same as putting up a blog article or getting even a publication in a magazine.
Right. Steve, what's your experience with publishing papers?
Interestingly enough, there's a whole lot of simple stuff that you need to be aware of. Don't submit more than 6,000 words if you can possibly avoid it. Any more than 6,000 words, you start to push limits of what journals are willing to publish. When I tried to publish my master's thesis, my first paper attempt was 13,000 words. I then got it down to 11,000 words, and it got rejected because of length from the best journal in the field called the History of Political Economy. And then after that double experience, I learned I've got to really put it in two chunks. And I put it in the second best journal, which is the Journal of the History of Economic Thought, and I went straight in to 1993 A and B. So that's the positive experience. I then had some referees have dramatically improved my paper, so they'll point out not necessarily a mathematical or logical flaw, but some flaw in the argument. And I find, in fact, the lower ranked the journal, to some extent, the better the refereeing. Because when you get to the so-called top-ranked journals, they get so many submissions. And this is even talking in a sensible area like physics or sociology. They get so many submissions, they want to reject. They reject for trivial reasons. Whereas the lower-ranked journals are trying to get a higher quality of submission. They'll often get very good refereeing out of that. So the Review of Political Economy, for example, gave me some extremely good refereeing over time and improved my work quite a bit. Then, of course, I've had the experience with right-wing journals, otherwise known as neoclassical economics, and they desk reject me. And I've had some great fun with that. The last time it happened with the American Economic Review Macro, rejected my paper on the financial crisis because it wasn't appropriate for their journal. You've got to be fucking kidding me, but that's neoclassicals. Oh no, the AER rejected it because it wasn't appropriate. Explaining the financial crisis wasn't appropriate for the American Economic Review. So I submitted to the American Economic Review Macro, and the editor of that, at least I'll give him credit, he wrote back to me. Des rejected it, but I thought I've had enough of these guys, so I went for the jugular. And we had a great conversation in one sense, which I decided to terminate when he wrote to me at one point, and I quote, and said, but what if they, meaning the public, get more information about the future? How will that change things? Information about the future. Welcome to the neoclassical mindset. So now I'm at the other end of my career in that sense, and I'm going to submit one more to the AER shortly just to annoy the shit out of the bastards, because I overthrow the whole of micro with it, with a very simple set of equations. But I expect to get rejected, and then I'll submit to the Review of Political Economy, and it'll turn up almost straight away. So intriguing experience. Economics tends to defend the paradigm, or you go for the people who are opposing the paradigm. Genuine sciences, you do get the sort of refereeing that Tim's talking about.
Right. Mike, any thoughts on academic papers, specifically with economics?
Yes.
Well, it's as much as it is science, it's a racket. And as we try and teach our doctoral students how to survive in the sort of the sociology of academic publishing, I also make all of our doctoral students go through a refereeing seminar where we teach them how to be referees on papers, which, by the way, helps you get your work published. Because if you do a good deed for an editor, referee, which is thankless because it's anonymous, you don't even get thanks to Mike Radzicki for reviewing this paper. You don't even get that. It's anonymous. When you submit a paper, often an editor will go, I got one slot here. I got 2 or 3 papers that are kind of all would be acceptable. Mike referees for me and does a good job. He gets the slot. So it's all part of the racket. It doesn't mean there's no science that goes on, so to speak, but so you got to get in, you got to get into the game, and you got to know who your people are, who your tribes are, who your journals are, and what have you. Certain journals, think if you're an editor, what's one of your main concerns? There's a lot of concerns. Your main concern is, will my readers read my journal? Will my readers read this article? Will they care? And if you're running a neoclassical journal, let's say, or one that doesn't do simulation modeling ever, that you send a non-neoclassical economics simulation paper, the editor is going to say, my readers are not going to read this, which means they're not going to read my journal. No, right? The referees often, as Steve correctly points out, defend a paradigm, which is kind of why they're refereeing for that journal. The paradigm is what counts as legitimate science. How do we do science? And if your paper contradicts the paradigm, it's likely to be rejected. It's not science, or it's not in harmony with the thinking of that journal, or what have you. So you really need to know your tribes, your people. Who is your audience? Who will like your stuff? What journals do they read? You want to go to those conferences and see those same people. The editors are going to be there. You referee for those people, and then you send your stuff to those journals. And that's how it works. A lot of journals were started by and are still run by universities. Journal of Political Economy is run out of the economics department at the University of Chicago. Quarterly Journal of Economics, Harvard Econ Department. Well, they train their students to publish in those journals and they know their people, right? So you got to find your tribes. Lastly, when referees come back, so let's say the editor reads your article. By the way, I've been on the editorial boards of 3 different journals, so I can speak with a little bit of confidence here. The editor reads the paper that comes in and says, okay, there's probably something here. It passes the first barrier. I'm going to send it out for refereeing, right? And the referees come back with, they don't reject it. They say typically revise and resubmit. So they found this or that problem or suggested improvements. I tell our students, you cannot blow off any of the referee's suggestions. You can say to the editor, I disagree with referee number 2's 3rd suggestion, and here's why, but you've addressed it. But to just skip them like, he's full of crap, he doesn't know what he's talking about there, I'm just going to skip it. No good. You have to, and sometimes the editor will say, ignore referee number 3's first 2 comments. Don't worry about them. So the editor's the final, sort of decider on all this stuff. But think about it. Again, if you're an editor or associate editor, you're in charge of shepherding some papers through the process, and you start overruling your referees. The next time you go to those referees, what are they going to say? Screw you. I make suggestions, you ignore them.
So that's all a part of the public record of the comments is all totally transparent, right, Mike?
When you say public record, it's...
Or the record between the academic and the editor and the referees, that's all visible.
Everybody, yes.
Everything's 100% visible.
Within that tight
only in that circle. Yeah. I mean, one of the problems about refereeing, it's worth having a good conversation here about it, is that it should be paid. Okay? Because in the old days, and I'm talking about 30 years ago, roughly, academics had plenty of time, and being a referee was part of the process of scholarship. And you would actually, as a referee, you'd actually learn some of the newest work by doing the refereeing. So it was worth doing. Now, because we've got these corporatized universities, you have no bloody spare time. The bureaucrats have decided that everything you do apart from giving classes and writing research proposals and spending time on measured research is not academic work. So you have no bloody spare time. You don't get paid to do it. It's an imposition. And consequently, I turn down most refereeing because these days I don't have time and I can't be bothered because it's to me it's become a bit of a racket. So I would rather say refereeing being formally recognised and paid by your university. And the other thing, of course, most of the journals are private, so that they're private and very profitable. They charge large amounts to the university libraries, places like Elsevier and so on. I don't know what price they charge, but it's quite substantial per journal. And they aren't paying referees, and often they're not even paying the editor. So it ends up being profit making racket for the private companies that are in the process, which have got great pack technology, by the way, which is why it's hard for academics to take over. No recognition for the academic himself in doing it, no time given. And that means consequently refereeing is much lower quality than people outside think. So you see, I've refereed academic paper says X. Well, it can be a shit piece of refereeing. And the classic instance for me is all the garbage published by neoclassical economists on climate change. Because once you get published in an area, you become somebody the editors will send papers to. So I get papers on Minsky, system dynamics, and so on these days. But if you're a neoclassical climate change person, you get published once, like let's say your name is, I don't know, like William Nordhaus, then the next article published, you get to see it, and you can then control the area that develops out of that. So what you get is a little cult, which is what the neoclassical climate change mob are, where they reinforce each other and refer each other and publish each other's shit. And I do mean shit. And consequently, they'll get criticized about using quadratic damage functions, for example, quite loudly and quite properly. And 21 years later or 40 years later, they're still using quadratic damage functions because they'll pass it as referees. So what we should have, there'd be a much higher standard, but much more expensive, is replication. If you publish a paper, okay, it should be possible for somebody else to replicate it, where that means build another system dynamics model from scratch and find you get the result you get, or do the empirical work and find it's correct, or do the experiment and confirm it. That's a much higher standard, but we don't do it.
And it's a step towards the reproducibility is a step towards the that scientific tradition, right? Absolutely, I agree with that. I have a question for Timothy about his hypothesis. So, so right now it's presented as a hypothesis, and you had mentioned that it has a degree of confidence. I'm assuming the model is what you're referring to, has a high degree of confidence. At what point in the process in your research do you think it's actually going to turn into a theory?
Well, I don't want to presume. It's up to someone else to determine when it becomes a theory. But my job is promoting the hypothesis to sort of lay the groundwork. So what we've done, and this is where I point out that this has been a long-term process where we actually had multiple papers. So if you were to think of it chronologically, we started with the data collection. I looked at 4,300 different terror events in Western Europe and the US. We did all sorts of data analysis. That's one paper. The second paper is the hypothesis, the building of the system structure. That's just what came out. The third paper was building an exploratory simulation to look at this generically and say, what are the contingencies? If we assume this hypothesis operates, what's the contingencies? Just purely generic and exploratory. And the fourth paper is, well, based on that, how do we counter it? What are the policies? We've now got, that was the fourth set.
But Timothy, I want to understand contingencies. Are you talking about like that idea of the stocks and flows? What are the things that are coming into the bathtub, basically?
Yeah, you use the simulation to test the contingencies of the hypothesis, which is if this were to change a little bit more or less, what effect does it have on the ultimate outcome? And again, it was very generic, but what I was getting to your point, this all lays the groundwork for empirical study. And if you go up on the Infomol at YouTube, you'll see in the first 4 videos, we have a plenary we gave in Chicago just a couple months ago where we're presenting the latest and greatest on this, which includes the empirical evidence now looking at, okay, we have the hypothesis, we made some predictions, we've now gone out and looked to see how do those predictions line up with what the empirical record is. Likewise, independent researchers, it's actually in the paper because it's been published so long after the initial idea, some of our early experiments that we recommended be done were done by independent researchers that were, just happening to look at the same thing, and we were able to reference those findings. So it's an iterative process where you propose the hypothesis, you propose some testable predictions, and then the empirical, you have to make sure they're falsified, that someone can falsify them. And then there's an iteration where someone looks at the data that either confirms the hypothesis and builds confidence, or it raises questions that have to be answered, or maybe it causes it to be falsified and you have to reject it. So we're just beginning now that process of getting into the empirical analysis, and others are as well. We're not the only ones doing this, where it would say, all right, good idea. That's nice. It's a hypothesis. It seems to make sense. Let's do the real rigor. And of course, throughout all of this in the academic cycle is a completely different cycle, working with social media content platforms, law enforcement, community groups who are actually looking to reduce the violence. They're on a different gear and cycle than the academics. So you're balancing between the two of doing good science, but also how do you go out and what confidence do you need to have before you say pilot a program? We're nowhere near piloting any of the things we recommended because we're not comfortable enough. But we are working with these groups to say, what's your data? What are you seeing? And like we talked in the last episode, engaging those stakeholders who aren't system dynamicists, but they live
Timothy,
it.
I got two questions here. Mike's fundamental starting point is trying to solve the problem. How
Right.
would you describe the problem that you're trying to solve?
Right. So the original problem was very simple, and it's within all of violent radicalization, which can cause many things. We really narrowed it down and says, what causes someone to become so violently radicalized that they go out and commit what's called a public mass killing? Public mass killing results in 4 or more fatalities by one person in a 24-hour period. So literally, we were looking at that. Now, to get to that problem, we talked about boundary last episode. We created a boundary to say this is the system of radicalization, but really within the paper, we kept it scoped in. And one of the reviewers was very uncomfortable that we weren't exploring all the permutations of the system of radicalization, nonviolent radicalization, societally beneficial radicalization. And we said, no, this is our problem. We're focusing on this one. It's not that those aren't useful, but our problem is what causes someone to commit a public mass killing. And we use that as our scoping. You can, in the paper itself, there's literally a section called the problem. And in the discussion, you'll see we reference this, that we didn't explore. We didn't want to gaze our navel at every type of radicalization that might be out there. Although we think, and it will come up later in Israel v. Palestine, we think we have a good model for a class of problems. We were really very focused on that one particular, whether you call it a Columbine style mass shooting of school, the Great White Replacement terror contagion in Norway, New Zealand, Buffalo, attacks on places of worship, other types of violent terrorist events. That's what we were really, really narrowly focused on.
Ty?
So Tim has put together we want to get into the Israel-Palestine situation. So first and foremost, we'll get Tim's opinion on what's going on there. And then he's got a short little presentation. He put together a little causal loop diagram, and I want him to walk us through that diagram. So Tim, first, what's your overall opinion on what's going on right now in Israel and the Gaza Strip, the West Bank? Just generalize, from your perspective, what is happening?
It's the problem with any conflict, and what I tell everyone going in there is get comfortable that there may be things occurring that are not mutually exclusive and equally horrific. It is very dangerous in these conflicts to try and isolate one side and pick an ideological winner and say this is the side that's right. In these kinds of conflicts, and I'll talk through the dynamics, it's very important to be specifically understanding how these conflicts arise. And I think in Hamas v. Israel, I've talked about, my blog has 2 long posts. There's a deep-rooted history that can be talked about, but there's more immediate cycles too that began literally in the last 15, 20 years. And it's easy from afar to project ourselves into these regions and say, oh, well, this is just a 2,000-year-old conflict. It will always be the same way. And I always say, no, there's really specific causes that are exacerbating this in a cycle. And so in addition to get comfortable that things may not be mutually exclusive, get comfortable with the concept of simultaneity of grievance, that there may be valid grievances on both sides that are expressing themselves in certain ways that contribute to the exacerbation of this conflict and results. So I don't see this as a one-off or things like that. We can talk about how horrific it was, or the civilian casualties on both sides. But to me, this is the challenge of why I do the work I do, is to get into these cycles and figure out how do we mitigate them or steer them away from the path they are on, or maybe, ideally prevent them from happening. That's probably a large scale, but this is just and it's not unique to Israel and Palestine. What I'm going to show here is these concepts of radicalization and violence are prevalent in all societies, all religions, all regions, all cultures, all history. I can go down the laundry list. But understanding that system structure gives us a way to look at it and say, how can we, what is a good thing and a bad thing to do? Like what, instead of just, reacting at it, which is fine. It's a visceral reaction. It's a visceral topic. If we want to be thoughtful about it and we have the opportunity to influence policy, what policies should be looked at and what ones should not be looked at. And that's sort of the approach I come from it at, given my job and my profession and where I'm standing. I admit that may not be emotionally satisfying for a lot of people who want to have like one side or the other, but that's not my job at this point in this time.
Right. So do you want to queue up your presentation? Everybody on the chat, thanks for chatting. This will probably be pretty divisive, but keep chatting. Let's see what you guys got to say. Make sure you hit that subscribe button for the Prof. Steve Keen YouTube channel so you get notifications of every show we do. Hit the like button. Likes are good for the algorithm. If you're over on Twitter, or now known as X, hit the repost button now. Repost and like button. Then come over here, join the chat. Again, we like your opinions. Does Tim have it queued up? He does not.
I'm queuing it now.
Okay. Here we go. Now, let me just set it up here first. This restream can be, let's see if I can full screen it. We're going to have to remove the chat temporarily. If you want to walk us through it, and then we'll keep silent, and then we'll get Mike and Steve's opinion, see what they have to say about it.
I'll try and keep this brief. The whole structure's in the paper, but the root of all radicalization begins with grievance, perceived grievance and moral outrage. And this could be personally perceived grievance, something happened to me or my family or someone I know. It can be vicarious grievance. I see something from afar and I see it moral outrage. Moral outrage is when the grievance we're expressing is human cause. It's not a natural disaster. It's not an act of whatever. It's literally human cause suffering. And this perceived grievance can coexist. And I'm going to walk through this structure and then we can talk about how to play it. But this structure is generic to any region or culture. These grievances can be valid. They are often rooted in valid perceptions. But the next stage of radicalization is there's a violent narrative. You can call this a conspiracy theory. You can call it a violent narrative. Something that explains this grievance and says, those folks over there are the cause of your suffering. And if you want to change your suffering, you have to take violent action. This narrative often is very complex. It's detailed, but it's a way of explaining this potentially valid grievance in a violent way. From that, some people, and there's always, think of these as having off ramps and things. Not everyone's going to follow this path. There's different narratives people might adopt. There might be different pathways off this. But if people going down the pathway of violent radicalization, they begin to fixate on the violent narrative. They begin to adopt this template ideology. They become very ideological. They live, breathe, eat, and sleep this narrative. They're constantly looking up. It pushes out other things in their life as they fixate on the violent narrative. That violent narrative that they fix on activates a violent identity. This is the key point that differs. Like, this model could explain nonviolent radicalization. You'd have a different narrative and you'd have a different identity. But the identity in violent radicalization is the warrior or the pseudo commando. It's somebody who takes upon themselves the belief they need to conduct violence to change the situation. And they're not doing it within the realm of a formal or even informal military structure, at least the ones we're initially studying. They're doing it as an act of an individual or a small group. When you activate that identity, that leads to a pathway of violence. The pathway to violence is everything you do preparing. You're acquiring your materials, you're getting your equipment, you're scouting locations, you're practicing, all the things you do, which leads to the predatory mass violence terrorism. This is the incident itself. It's a public mass killing. It generates huge media because that template method you use tells you how to, unfortunately, kill as many people as you can. And this is why you see these trends spawn up in these social contagions of similar style attacks. But that mass violence terrorism happens in a society that then the society sparks a reaction, the societal response to terrorism. And this then can lead to new grievances. The society reacts and perpetuates the grievance. And we call this the governed space. It is used in the context of this is all occurring potentially in a domestic space where if you could influence with law investigation, you could run surveillance, you could basically use normal law enforcement means. But challenging this growth of radicalization in the domestic space is the ungoverned space. Now, in our perception, the ungoverned space can be physical, a physical space, but it could also be online. It means where your normal law enforcement activities are challenged. So it could be 8chan, it could be the dark web, it could be some online, it could even be a forum where people gather. It's some online space. And in these spaces, physical or online, non-state actors who want to perpetuate this violent ideology for their own purposes, they get a safe haven. The strength of the safe haven, it deals with the strength of the non-state actors, and they then flood these cultural scripts, these memes and information. You can call it propaganda, you can call it you can even call it accurate reporting. But what they do is they're broadcasting to the broadly out. They're amplifying that grievance. They're providing the narrative that exploits that grievance. And then there's a narrowcasting. Because of the way social media works, you can create a very close relationship with someone on a Twitter or something like that. If they get someone who can move along this pathway, then that narrowcasting is saying, you need to fixate it, you need to consume our information, you need to live this. And by the way, you should activate that violent identity. Look at me, I did this. This is exacerbated by the severity of a conflict zone. If this non-state actor is a bunch of gaggle nuts sitting in an internet chat room, doing that, that's low. But if they're in a conflict zone, say Gaza or at the Bundy Ranch or January 6th, the cachet of the people in that conflict zone, because it can be very short conflict zones, their cachet and credibility goes up, and the amplification of their scripts into this radicalization cycle increases. So, and I'm getting to the end here because I don't want to take up too much time away from the chat and the questions, but what happens when you have a state actor that's responding to this mass violence that just happened, and they see a non-state actor hiding out in a safe haven? Well, they do an intervention to eliminate that safe haven. And this intervention could be, if it's physical, it could be a military. You talk about Afghanistan, but it could be virtual. You could purge the accounts on Twitter after January 6th. You could go in and shut down certain portals on the web. You can deplatform. These interventions are attempting to destroy this safe haven so the non-state actors can no longer broadcast. The problem is, from that intervention, you have something called the accidental guerrilla effect. And I can get in this later, but it basically means when you move into someone else's space, even if you're targeting a bad actor in that space is occupied by other people, and they're going to reject you coming in simply because now you're in their space, and you're going to inadvertently harm them or intentionally harm them. They're going to radicalize against you simply because you're in their space. This then, ironically, you intervene to decrease the strength of the non-state actor, but the accidental guerrilla can make the non-state actor even stronger, and it amplifies the severity of the conflict zone, which then results in all of these things becoming more important. And you can see here at the bottom, I've just, for purposes of this context, we built this years ago, but you can see Israel and Gaza. And the last thing I want to say is this is not exclusively a single loop phenomenon. You could swap these and say that Gaza's perception of the Palestinian perception, their perceived grievance, that Israel is exacerbating with like the Al-Aqsa interventions or the settler provocations. So these loop structures are operating simultaneously within different populations that perceive each other's grievances. They both have the grievance and they perceive the terrorism from the other side, spawning this cycle. And I'll pause there so we can get back to the conversation, but thank you. Oh, the last thing is winning the war and winning the peace. That's the sort of the analytical framework. You can win the war on the left militarily, but my opinion in my studies is you cannot win the peace unless you solve that grievance. So the grievance is core to winning the peace.
So Dan, where's Mike? Did Mike disappear? Mike disappeared. So Dan, Steve, opinions, please.
Well, I'll just focus on the last piece. How do you solve a grievance that is it focuses on the annihilation of the other party? Like, that's a hard one to put on the table.
Yeah, so that is the challenge of the narrative, the violent narrative that comes out, right? And Hamas's violent narrative is, and this is where I say the two mutually existing grievances, one of which is Israel's grievances. We perceive that there are actors around us with good cause who want to eliminate us and drive us out of existence. That's a valid grievance. On the other hand, the Palestinian grievance is we perceive that Israeli is occupying us and they perceive it as apartheid. Now, into that, non-state actors come and appropriate that grievance, and Hamas, as a particular non-state actor, says, we're going to appropriate that grievance of the Palestinians by saying we're going to eliminate Israel. We're going to drive them into sea. And this is, Hamas says this. They don't mince words about it. We can talk about the history of Hamas, but then that is picked up by certain factions within Israel that say, hey, look at this Hamas actor. And part of what I described is this tug and play between, let's get more detailed than Israel and Palestine. Let's talk about the leadership of Hamas and the leadership of Israel. In Israel, you have Netanyahu, who almost in some ways coexists with Hamas because his political argument is, I will protect you from Hamas. It's been that case for 20 years. And he's done intentional efforts to delegitimize alternatives to Hamas like Fatah and the Palestinian Authority because he's a, kind of strong security. I'm going to protect you. He needs Hamas as much as Hamas needs him because both sides on that small faction and the power elite are now opposing each other with a narrative that allows them to rally up the populations within them. So you have, and in Israel, there's a version of Hamas in Israel called the Khanis. It's the Catch Party. It was declared a terrorist group. It got disbanded and illegal, but the Khanist ideology is a flip version of the Hamas. It says there should be no one but Jews in Israel, and anyone who's not a Jew is an enemy. And the Khanist sympathizers are now in Netanyahu's government. Ben Gvir is the common example. So this is where I'm sort of saying, to get past mutually exclusive things, Hamas can say, and I think it's wrong to say, I'm not a fan of wiping out anyone. Let's be clear on that. But Hamas's sort of approach of we're going to wipe you off the map, we're going to push you in the sea, is met within Israel by a faction of Khanists who say the same thing back. And they both are in a position of power where there's almost like a perverse alliance that they can cause suffering on both populations from the top down because of this mutual coexistence of exploiting those narratives.
Good explanation. Steve, what are your thoughts?
Oh, because it's just the technical level. You have very large number of positive feedbacks there, but no dampening feedbacks that I could see. So what's the story there?
I simplified it. There's like a whole bunch more in that middle big circle that have the dampening, the limits to growth. I can go back and show them if I want, but it makes the causal loop diagram even more complicated. But there is a whole host of negative feedback loops that affect this.
Okay. And then in terms of which family of models would you think this fits into? One possibility is a predator-prey model, but another one would be where there's two very similar species, both exploiting the same resource. And in that particular case, the outcome is that one drives the other to extinction. So which would you put it into, predator-prey or two predators both attacking the same source?
So when we model this, we actually use, for the individuals, we use a farmer, soldiers, bandits construct. We don't use we don't use an infection. I don't like using infection models when dealing with this. But we use the farmer, soldiers, bandits, where people can move across a continuum of radicalization. And they can be either, moderated relative to the radicals or radical and violent. So they can move back and forth. And the levels of the population in all those three determine sort of the outcome of the radicalization. At the state actor level, we likewise use a continuum approach to look at the population sentiments. In the big model, we have 4 stocks. Do you perceive the government as legitimate and governed? You fully support them. Are you calculated legitimacy? They're the best choice for now. Or are you being coerced to stay in it? If it wasn't for a police state, you'd be outside that government. And then we map those. Each state and non-state actor has one of those continuums for every population segment. So when we do these models, we do it with multiple civilian segments. So you can capture the differences of, it's not just Israeli and Palestinian. It wouldn't even be Shia Muslims in Palestine or Sunni Muslims in Palestine or Khanist Jews versus Orthodox. You really get specific, and you can look at the contesting legitimacy between these state and non-state actors and understand how it plays. It's a little bit beyond the predator-prey, but that definite oscillating back and forth is sort of the characteristics we see, the oscillating pattern of action and reaction, sort of like a phase disequilibrium. If I need to explain that for your audience, let me know. But it's very much a phase disequilibrium because the acts of one actor perpetuate after a time delay the reaction of the other actor. And that then creates the cycle back and forth, which goes back into time.
Now, are you getting population numbers of this, or is this like individuals radicalization?
So the radicalization model is based on populations of what we call a high-risk population, people who are already susceptible to this. And this is because we're studying school shootings, white supremacy, things like that. And there's a limited population. What we found doing tests is that population is worldwide, doesn't have to be large for these mass violent attacks. But when you get into state and non-state actor conflicts, we are modeling the entire population in that region. So we're modeling. So in the Myanmar Civil War, there's 15 different ethnicities. We model each one, but if you sum them all up, it's a conservation of mass problem. You always are navigating that you have to have a number of people in the country equal to what you started, plus who was born, plus who was killed, plus who left, and or who changed sides. It always has to equal out. So we do make sure that's balanced in the larger model.
Okay. Mike, did you catch the presentation, or were you out of the way? Mike?
Mr. Radzicki.
Can Mike hear us? Or?
Mike?
Yeah, we're having weather-related internet problems.
Oh dear.
Can you hear me?
It's off and on.
Yeah.
Okay, well, Mike's working that out. We got a couple questions here. So one from Bob Leor. I guess he was looking at your causal loop there. Should there not be a branch between violent and non-violent action first?
Absolutely. If the problem we were studying included nonviolence, this is I think the nature of when we talk about modeling a problem. If we were talking about what causes nonviolent movements, for example, someone to be radicalized to civic reform or civil disobedience or perhaps protest, there would be that grievance might start the same, but then the branch would occur in the narrative. The narrative is what contextualizes the grievance. The narrative says, this is who's responsible. This is what you should do. This is how you change. And that creates the branch, the first branch between violent and nonviolent. There's other branching opportunities. There's activated identities that are violent, but themselves do not practice violence. And that's at the very extreme end. You got a very radicalized ideological person, but they're not committing violence themselves. So you can have different off-ramps, and future papers, we intend to explore this. But in this particular paper, we were really focusing on what gets us to that terrorism on the right. And that would be, that was sort of the focus of the scoping problem.
Mike, are you with us now?
Can I give a quick shout out to Lana Del Hates the Clock, my favorite commentator who wasn't here last time I was on. I just saw she did something, solve the grievance. Grievance is the core. If there's one thing that's core of these cycles, whether it's individual or state versus non-state, it's grievance. That's the key.
Yeah. And that would be this comment. Lana Del, thanks for being here. Once again, was she not here for your last appearance?
No, I just about tripped on her name on the fast read though.
Yes. Well, I think Dan has almost tripped on her name as well. Mike, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. What are your thoughts on Tim's kind of causal loop diagram?
Yeah, so we have, as I mentioned, we're having heavy rains and such today, and we were knocked out completely. All the power went out at the house, and so I just restored everything. So I didn't catch all of it, but yeah. So the Farmers Bandits model, Khalid Saeed's original model, presents a similar kind of modeling idea to the Afghan coin strategy that I put a link to. Which I think is the way to go. I think Tim is spot on that you have stocks of folks that are in various levels of adherence to a particular point of view, and they can move among them as circumstances change. And then you're modeling all the pressures that make people move from being I'm neutral or I'm sympathetic to I'm radicalized and all that sort of thing. So because I've been asked when I've mentioned Tim's work to others, how can you possibly model this stuff? So it's very clever modeling. Yeah, the causal loop diagram, I love it. That doesn't show a lot of detail, and it's not supposed to. It just gives an audience a perspective on the main driving feedback loops in a particular situation. Some people use the causal loop diagram for brainstorming. I tend not to ever do that. Some people love doing that, but I think as a tool to present some of the main ideas in an otherwise very complicated model, it's a wonderful tool. Everybody can understand arrows and cause and effect And I think the tricky business, which Tim handled very nicely, is presenting the concepts at the tail and the heads of the arrows, right? And then people can kind of see how cause effects, if that's the way to put it. But then there's the key feature of system dynamics modeling, the sort of stuff we do here, and that is there's loops. And the loops can reinforce things or counteract things, right? And then, of course, on net, whether things are growing, declining, whatever, then now you have to write equations and run simulations to find out, the details. So I love what he did. Tim is one of our shining star graduates from WPI's program. We're very proud of him, and we say, rah, rah, keep going.
Hold on. Yeah. So we've got another. Okay, so Michael D'Souza Cruz has been asking this question in many different shapes and forms for the last 45 minutes. Do you address authoritarian cults and undue influence and mind control? Can you speak on that, Tim?
So the way I view things is that, and I want to be careful. I'm not again, the problem we're modeling is individuals committing public mass killings. Cults are their own animal, but I think there's commonalities in that the cult looks for a grievance to exploit, right? People go into a cult because there's something they think the cult will solve. The cult hits them with a certain narrative, and there's tactics of this like love bombing, and that's a separate conversation. But the cult then diverges, I think, off because the activated identity in a cult at first isn't go out and kill yourself because they want the people in the cult. It's become a cult member. Give me your money, give me your resources, join my society, have sex with the leader, right? That identity of a cult is what the cult activates. And that then leads to different actions. From the authoritarian standpoint, I do believe that if you start with a violent ideology, a big part of my early papers was how do you get from random groups of individuals expressing grievance to a clandestine terror cell, to insurgency, to an emerging state actor, to a state actor. Authoritarianism is more at the state level. You need the apparatuses of the state, but they may play upon this state itself, may be broadcasting that narrative. I mean, we all lived through the global war on terrorism, which was you're either with us, this is the neocon perspective, right? You're with us or you're against us. If you're against the Bush policies, you support the terrorists, something I very strongly disagree of. And I'm seeing elements of that coming out again, where the state then takes or appropriates the grievance of we just suffered this massive attack, we're in shock, appropriates it to spread a message that protects the administration from criticism and critique. So these things are all interacting in the same space. I want to be careful that I don't get on thin ice, that I didn't study cults, but I can see where these dynamics can overlap and go back and forth.
So we got some more questions here, but first I'm going to get you to do the list. And you've done the list before. You've been down this road.
And that's
you know
where
what
it
it's
went
about.
downhill.
So our viewers have pretty much doubled since you were last on. So the list is a little bit longer. The names are a little bit more bizarre. Here they are. Top chatters, top commenters from last week. Tim, go ahead.
Ghost on the Half Shell, Wayne McMillan, Tom Crusader, great second pick round draft, Botch Mandela, Jovian R, Alex Plante, Left to It All, Ryan H, John Lennon, Michael D'Souza Cruz in the authoritarian and cult space, Alexis Romanovich, Brad Atherton, Mark Andrew Damaris, Jimmy. That was easy. Thanks, Jimmy. I appreciate that being easy. WWE fan 0104, Felipe Burns, Jeremiah Ham, Stefanitza 27, Rock Paletke, J Mills, D Bruce, Apple Scab. Then on the right side, not declaring any ideological basis, Dr. EGI, EMC, Algorithm, Ralph McNeil, Nicholas Gomez, Thomas Surdej, Tony Wilson, Stephen Hilton, Bob Lohr, Alexandros Tordera, TR, another easy name, appreciate it. Gooser 3000, Menorhan, Amber Grigio, Shot, Joe Polito, Lana Dell hates the clock, #1, thank you. Scherer Wise, The Minstrel 55, Dr. Feelgood, Web Freaks, and David Branch.
Nailed it. Definitely
He
nailed it.
nailed it. I think we should have him back every week to do that.
Yeah, I think
lack of oxygen. I'll just tip over.
Can't think about it. You just got to roll. You just got to go. Can't think on it. Just
wow.
Just a quick story about cults, right? So years ago, we're at the System Dynamics Conference, and the founder of the field, Jay Forrester, his birthday happened to almost always coincide with the International System Dynamics Conference. So one year, somebody got the great idea, let's have a giant cake, let's bring it out at a plenary session, and let's have 500 people sing happy birthday to Jay. So that was done. And when we finished, to you, the guy next to me turns to me and says, welcome to the cult.
Yeah, well, Jay's a good reason to have a cult, but I've had a couple.
You don't think there is one?
Yeah, I mean, I've suffered from that cult, I might add, because one of my papers was rejected by the cult leader because they didn't have an empirical component to it. Mike knows about that one well. But like, if you have a cult which actually gives you a way of understanding the world, that's rather different to most cults. So that's why I've got much more time for system dynamics than, say, Scientology or even worse, neoclassical economics. But I've had, there was a time, this would be about, well, must be at least 40 years ago, a friend of mine was an Irish activist in the IRA, working as a painter in Sydney, as it happens. And one of his colleagues called over and was helping him work on a house for one of my friends. And this guy was just literally turned up in the country, very much out of the whole Northern Ireland situation. This is before we had the reconciliation. And I cannot forget him saying, and this is the way he said it, his attitude to how he could solve the crisis. I think it would take an act of indescribable horror to drive the British out of Northern Ireland. I thought, what a fucking lunatic. And that's caught up in the whole cult way of thinking. And of course, Jerry Adams did the exact opposite. And what you had to do effectively was recognizing the grievances of the other side. And then even the British played a, yes, I did. I did lump neoclassical economics with Scientology, and I apologize to any Scientologists who are watching. Yeah, so what you had was a recognition of both sides that this is just we're going to continue doing each other unless we realise we've both got grievances. And I believe the British actually played a minor role in helping them reach that commonality, even though, of course, the British set the whole damn thing up with the Orange invasion several hundred years earlier.
Yeah, I think key to Tim's work and the work in this space, really all the modeling we do, but sticking to the topic at hand here, is the concept of feedback, which Tim very nicely outlined with his causal loop diagram. And I don't think most people think in terms of feedback loops, including feedback loops with delays, which makes it difficult to attach, cause to effect. But they don't think that way. We're not taught to think that way typically in at least the Western world and our educational system and what have you. But as Tim showed, this problem space is loaded with feedback loops. The idea that you do something, but it's going to eventually come back and have a feedback effect on you, right? And if you don't take that into account, and there's a lot of these loops, you're driving with your eyes closed.
It's the feedback loops that create the unexpected effects. I think that's the challenge with linear thinking is I'm going to do something that seems obvious at the time, even seems morally right or valid or legitimate, and not realize how it comes back to hurt me in the long run. Or I didn't, and we talked about last time, unintended consequences. There's some of the simulations we do. The reason why the simulation helps, and I've got one I can show just as a sample, is it can move forward over time and show you that unintended consequence of that extremely valid, sensible thing that made sense. It can show you what happens and give you a chance to view into not the future, but a potential future to educate about how those feedback loops interact over time.
Do you have something queued up here on the screenshot?
Yeah,
okay, let me bring bring that back up and we'll get it on the screen.
So this is actually relevant, and people talk about what's going to happen and what's going on. This is actually, so part of our model includes that intervention. We talked about the intervention in the safe haven. If I can clear the chart, this is reviews to the ungoverned space, the grievance on the left. Think of this as a nominal level of grievance, right? It's a very abstracted concept, but that's because grievance is tricky. But at 0.1, 10% of the population has the grievance. Just think of it a very simple 0 to 1, and we're at 10% of the population holds that grievance that may be driving the narrative and the violent radicalization. On the right is the casting capacity. And we were looking at this as casting capacity for cultural scripts and misinformation and things like that. But you can think of this as just replace the word casting with military capacity, right? This gets into a system dynamics concept that is vital to understand, which is that grievance is the carrying capacity of the conflict. And think of that as like, we think of weeds in a garden or grass or things like that. We look at the weeds in the grass. We go out and weed the garden, right? We pull up the weeds we don't like. The carrying capacity of that growth is the roots and water underneath in the latent system. The grievance is the latent system that gives food and water to this radicalization to grow, this capacity that you're trying to do. And if you don't affect that, it's just like pulling weeds. And we show that in this simulation. So on the left, you have an existing grievance that then branches at time 30 months. There's a terrorist act, and you're going to go intervene. And the different interventions are, if you, the red dashed one is you intervene in the safe haven, but you provoke a backlash. The orange is you don't intervene in a violent way. You intervene to reduce the grievance. So you can see here two counterfactuals breaking at a point in time. One says we intervene militarily, but in doing so, we create more grievance. So you see the grievance goes up. The other is we may not intervene militarily, or we're doing something that reduces the grievance, so the grievance goes down. This is the carrying capacity of the military capacity, which is on the right here. So on the right shows, again, very notional at this level. Think of this as the amount of military capacity. Say, you could even say this is Hamas or violent non-state actors opposed to Israel, right? What is their capacity to harm Israel? Well, if you start with an existing grievance, right, you intervene militarily, you're going to drop it to zero. Congratulations, you've taken out Hamas. You've removed them. You've done, the U.S. Take the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. We drove the Taliban out relatively quickly. But then this red dash line, we have increased the grievance. So that carrying capacity is higher than it was. We've added more nutrients to the soil. We've added more water flow, and it grows back slightly larger than it was before. And so we intervene again, and we drop it back down to zero. And then it grows back even larger, and you get this escalating series called pulling weeds, where you're literally doing serial raids to periodically go in and eliminate the bad guys, but you're never addressing that grievance. You're doing it in a way that creates backlash. And each time they come back stronger and larger. Versus if you go in the first time and eliminate the grievance, this actually reduces the grievance that fuels them. And if anything could describe the challenge of the Israeli-Palestine situation, or specifically the Netanyahu administration and Hamas, it's that they're pulling weeds on each other. There's some provocation, and who starts what doesn't matter. It could be a settler provocation. It could be a provocation at Al-Aqsa Mosque. It could be a provocation across the border zone. There's a retaliation and an escalation, and pretty soon Hamas is firing rockets or Israel's doing airstrikes. That is the intervention that creates the grievance. And it just perpetuates, and every time it gets a little bit worse because it never resolves the mutual underlying grievance of the actual people. The Palestinians is, we feel oppressed, occupied, and view you as apartheid. And the Israelis as, we feel like we're under existential threat. And by the way, you're living under a non-state actor who advocates that to us. So this is a simulated mathematical example of a dynamic that you could just use to describe the last 20 years in Israel and Palestine without having to go back to 2,000 years ago. You could say this is a cycle.
So I just want to leap in with one remark that I think is will be helpful to our conversation today. And that is, let's say we produce a system dynamics model of some issue. Let's say it's Tim's model, and it's the best model on the planet for this particular issue. By the way, I think it probably is. Okay, how do we use it for really making the world a better place? Because, of course, Forrester would tell us, we're not here to do the theory of bridge building. We have a river, we got to get vehicles across it and people across it, and we want to build a bridge. And if the model is a tool that helps us do that, that's great. But once the model's built and we've gotten insights into bridge building, we throw the model away, or at least take it offline, and we build a bridge. We're not building, we don't want to have a model of building a bridge that we put on the wall and admire, right? There's a reason for doing it, right? Making the world a better place, solving a problem in the real world. So what's our experience in system dynamics with doing that? I think we get a win on the scoreboard when a model becomes part of the conversation. And I'll give you an example. There was a well-known system dynamics guy named Nat Mass. He's passed away a while ago, but he was really good. He taught at MIT for a while, and he became a consultant. And he would tell the story about how he was doing consulting at ExxonMobil. And at the highest levels of ExxonMobil, they were talking about their chemical business, particularly in Asia. And they all agreed around the table, we should shut down, if I'm remembering the story correctly, we should shut down a plant somewhere in Asia. And before they said, all in favor, let's do it, somebody in the room said, did we have that guy, Nat Mass, build us a system dynamics model of all this stuff? Can we at least see what the model says? And so somebody said, all right, fine, have so-and-so go run. They came back and they said, that's a bad idea, and here's why. They said, what? And when they went through the simulations, they found out that they weren't taking into account, as Tim kind of alluded to before, some reactions down the road in the system, some unintended consequences, right? And it changed their mind. So they didn't say that the prediction of the model was it would be, we will save $2.73 million or anything. That's not how they're using it. It was like, let's run it we got a model here. Let's make it a routine part of our decision-making to see what the model has to say and make it part of the conversation. To be honest with you, I think that's with modern technology, that's about as good as you can get with system dynamics. You know, whether it's someday a system dynamics model is going to run ExxonMobil or something, I don't know. But today, I think that's about the best we can do to get it accepted at the decision-making level, and it becomes a routine part of the decision-making.
So I want to just let everybody know, Tim said he was good. Since his paper's behind a paywall, if you want to find him on Twitter, and I'll bring up his Twitter handle right here. Get a hold of him on Twitter and discreetly ask him for the paper.
Discreet.
Yeah, okay. I don't know what the rules are giving out, papers that are published and,
As the author, I have full rights to give out any of the 6 papers I've written on this, so happy to do so.
There you go. If you are not a member of the System Dynamics Society and don't have access to the journal, you can get it from Tim. I'm going to try to read it sometime this week. I have so many things to read. It's hard to get to these things, but I'm going to try to read it. So yeah, reach out to him there, get a hold of this paper, and probably give you a deeper understanding of everything other than, the broad overview of the causal loop diagrams. I think you could dig a little deeper with the actual paper. Do we have any more questions? We do. I've got them bookmarked here. Let's bring those up. Here's one from Thomas Sergit. What do we got here? What are your views on the Russian-Ukraine war? We probably covered this last time, but let's cover it again. Tim, what are your thoughts?
I started covering this as I saw what was about to happen. I saw I covered it on the Infomullet. So if you go to the Infomullet and click Foreign Affairs, Russian-Ukraine war, you'll get a whole bunch of the current one, and you'll see I'm reloading the ones from the Euromaidan Dignity Revolution 2014. But my view, the mental model I've been trying to get everyone geared around this since March of last year is that this is going to be an attritional, stalemated conflict. And I think that's more recognized now, but there was a lot of belief that there would be some highly mobile breakthrough. We always see these technology game changers. And what the reality is, it's an absolutely brutal, both to the civilians and the military, it's a brutal slugfest that's going to basically stay centered around a line of control. And if you want to think about it in a mental model, it's more like World War I or the Korean War, where there's years of conflict around a center line that may move a little bit this way, may move a little bit that way. There may be exhaustion at some point, but the daily grind is just over meters of land. And I've been trying to prepare people that this is a long-term conflict, the scale of which we haven't seen in a long time, of how many combatants conventionally. What Israel is doing in Gaza is a state actor versus a non-state actor. Russia versus Ukraine is 2 state actors going at each other that is effectively using the armaments of the Cold War. Literally, the vast stockpiles of the Cold War are being funneled into Ukraine. So we're seeing in some ways the entire military output of the Cold War conventionally fought in a World War I style on the border in that line of control of Ukraine. So I have hopes that I think, it will eventually resolve, but it's not going to be anytime soon. I don't foresee a large breakout. I can answer specific questions. We have done some modeling there where we looked at, but that was post-conflict stabilization. If there's a hypothetical ceasefire or a hypothetical one side retreats, what we were modeling for the Marine Corps was, what does post-conflict stabilization look like? How do you resolve these grievances, right? How do you rebuild the infrastructure, the economy? How do you remove all the mines? So that's really where my focus was. And I could do an entire episode on Russia, Ukraine, but that's sort of the high level overview of where I sit on it.
I have a question about your model. That's brilliant, by the way, Timothy. I mean, how you were able to suspend the state versus state, and then the non-state versus that's very interesting, and a talent. That's really cool. It's interesting how you separate the two. Going back to your work, I'm thinking that this for me reduces down to violence begets violence, and you're basically modeling it. I don't mean to simplify it, but there is a point with this, and I'm curious about jumping off of Mike's point. This appears to be a groundbreaking authoritative model, maybe in its infancy, but wouldn't we think that the Israeli government or intelligence agencies would be interested in the work you're doing? Don't you think that seems like a gimme?
Yeah, well, I think in system dynamics with these models, from an ethics standpoint, we always got to declare our bias, because as a modeler, we bring a bias to it. And my bias is I'm not a pacifist. I do not, my paradigm is conflict. That comes out in my work. To your point, that violence begets violence. Most times that is correct, but sometimes there are situations, at least I believe, where you need to separate a bad actor who themselves are violent. You need to isolate them from the population, and you need to use violence to keep them from doing violence on others. So I just want to put that out there as an ethical thing. I think if I were to give advice, and I've given some advice on my blog, not that they're picking up the phone, this is going to blow up the comments, I'm sure. There are rules of warfare that were created for a reason. And the principles of the laws of warfare are in some ways designed to minimize these things. I'm going to say that before I take a breath. They are often violated, and the violations are so numerous we could spend hours talking about them. But if you think about what the principle of those laws of warfare, it's about minimizing that violence to only what is necessary. I mean, literally the most important principle of all is distinction between combatant and non-combatant. Are you targeting someone who is a military combatant, or are you targeting a civilian? Even if you're targeting a military combatant, military necessity, proportionality, humanity, that you don't inflict unnecessary suffering. I think that is a little bit more nuanced version of that. Unrestricted violence begets more violence. Obviously, grievance reduction might eliminate violence, but if you have to use violence, it needs to be very constrained, very limited, very credible. Like, for example, I study mass shootings in schools. I don't think anyone would disagree that when a mass shooter's in the middle of shooting someone and a police or a civilian responds with a firearm and kills them, they say, you know what, that was a necessary form of violence. And that's a pretty extreme example, but it sort of anchors the discussion. Likewise, in Ukraine, you have an invasion from Russia that I think has to be met with violence, because the Russian invasion started that violence. But it's one of those things that, unrestricted violence begets violence. Restricted violence may solve it, but it's so tricky and so hard.
The only thing I was commenting on is that oscillation graph where you show that it escalates, like it's oscillating between going down to zero, and then so really that's really what I was focusing on.
And to get back to that state and non-state actor, the big difference in violence, and this is where people get confused, even military planners. In state actor conflict, it's a conventional conflict. So mass in some ways wins. The more you can do to the other side, you can take out their industry, you can reduce their capacity to fight. That is a pretty linear equation, and we've seen lots of examples where you do it. The non-state actor, that is an asymmetric conflict. And asymmetrics are really tricky because they trigger these feedback loops and delays over time, where you can use violence to reduce an actor. Like I'll again use the American invaded, they knocked the Taliban out. They had maybe a few hundred members in 2002 scattered around Pakistan, Waziristan, but yet By 2014, they had 80,000 militants. That was driven not as a conventional conflict, but by these asymmetric factors that, to your point, you create backlash. It creates larger effects. And so the trick is understanding, what territory you're standing on. Is this a conventional conflict, or is this an asymmetric conflict? And if it's an asymmetric, you don't understand those asymmetries, they're gonna come back to hurt you, even if what you think you're doing is the right thing.
Yeah, I love that. Asymmetry isn't symmetrical, but it sounds like it is. It's so close to a play on words. But I'm curious about something, Timothy. It's not at all a criticism of the work. It's just a subtle observance. Maybe you could break out for me and the audience where in your research the agent-based data collection separates from aggregate populations. That would be very interesting to me. And then also, I have a question, since on the theme of strange loops or loops in general. Are you aware of any of Hofstadter's thoughts on strange loops? And is this just like Escher mind puzzles for you, if you are aware of it?
Well, let me start. That was a lot of questions, but let me start pulling from something Mike taught me about data collection and how to aggregate in models. I think, you think about deductive, top-down, inductive, bottom-up, and we like to do what are called generative theory creation. So you collect a lot of cases. In this case, we collected the 4,300 terror incidents. I went through every single terror incident by hand, 4,300 of them, maybe 4,600 of them. That's inductive. You're collecting empirical data. From that, you arise typologies, patterns, commonalities. This is this pattern or that pattern that you see, that amongst that data, you see those, and you can use statistics to sort them out. Then you create models that say, can I replicate that typology to what I saw, plus some plausible counterfactuals? And then you elevate to the next level up as the principle. What is now the principles common across the typologies, as opposed to being a one-off unique to that? And that's sort of how you go from a individual data standpoint up to an aggregate level hypothesis like the terror contagion. We also did a lot of work. I won't get into it. If you like causality in complex systems, there's a whole section about perceiving a complex system as a cubic space with top-down and bottom-up causations working simultaneously. So there's a chunk of the article where we disentangle that. But to your point about the models, where does a model of individuals becomes a model of the state? Very intentionally, I split those out. Remember, you want to model a problem, not the system. And even though we recognize that one connects to the other, we build separate models. And we actually have what we call the hand-wavy space, which is kind of in between the model of individual radicalization leading to terrorism. That can model up to small groups, small cells, clandestine, very small autonomous groups. The emerging state actor model picks up where that becomes a network. Like the lowest level, you can have mass mobilization and nonviolent stuff, but the lowest level of violence in that model is what's called a clandestine terror network, more like the KKK or the IRA or something like that. So you do have breaks in your models. Rather than trying to model everything, you build your model for different purposes. And there's a lot of technical reasons why, but it's better to have many smaller models than one all-inclusive model, just from a technical standpoint, debugging, keeping it accurate, building confidence.
Looks like Bob's a little upset with you, Tim.
Well,
but that's okay. We like that. I just want to, Dan. I just realized I can.
Oh, he should ask. I can answer that. Like,
yeah, we'll get that to it in a second. Sorry. So I can do this, and I didn't realize I could full screen. And I feel bad for Steve because we've always had small windows for screen share. I didn't realize I could overwhelm the screen with one view only. That's really cool. It only took me a year to figure that out.
More buttons to push.
Yeah.
In defense, I actually think that was a newer feature. It's the one, people can't see. It's the one on the far left with the little guy. And in Tim's defense, I think that Tim, if we rewind the tape, I think we actually heard Tim say that there's very specific laws that, right? I mean, because then you went into the point about distinctions between civilians and right. So war crimes, these are laws. They're established.
let Tim defend himself against Bob Wheeler.
Sorry.
So if you want to go back and see, again, I didn't plan this in advance. Go back to my first article on the Monday after this happened. It's on the Infomullet blog. It's labeled Hamas v. Israel. Scroll down to where it says Grozny rules. And you'll see in there that I actually apply these principles to Israel in its retaliation. And Grozny rules, for those who aren't familiar, Grozny was a town of Chechen separatists that had an insurgency against Russia in the late 90s. It was part of the Chechen uprising. It kind of humiliated Russia in the first one, in that they beat back Russia. When Putin took power, he used what has come to be called Grozny rules. He used massive amounts of aerial bombardments to simply level the city. It wasn't like a fight was going on. He just bombed the heck out of the civilian population. And they used it again in Syria to flatten Aleppo. And I commented on what happened in Syria, and I commented on what happened in Ukraine. And even when this thing started, I said, Israel cannot engage upon Grozny rules. The rules of warfare that I'm talking about, Israel has to apply itself. And don't take my word for it. These are in Israel's Defense Law of Warfare manual. You can go to their manual and look up where they have ascribed to themselves the limitations. Again, the principles aren't always followed. I'm not going to say everyone does it, but when we look at why these principles matter, it's that Israel has to distinguish civilian from non-combatant. I don't think they're doing a good job at that. They have to only use military necessity and proportionality. I think they're probably reacting in shock to the attack they're doing. You know, I model these types of aerial campaigns. They've hit Gaza 6,000 times. When I model an aerial campaign, 500 sorties a day is shock and awe. And they're way above that. So there's room for debate, I think, or discussion. But don't ever take me as saying that unrestricted bombing as a civilian population is a good idea. I'm very strongly opposed about that. And you're sensing the hackles rise on me. It's because I'm so adamant about this in all contexts that you cannot do unrestricted bombing of a civilian population and then claim you are operating within the laws of warfare. Sorry, that was a bit of a tangent and a rant, but I felt important to clarify where I stand on that.
And I myself, I've got your nuance on it all throughout the conversation. Yeah. I just thought it was really fun to kind of put you on the spot there. And Bob, Steve, you're back. Guess what, Steve? So I realized in the future, with screen sharing, I do control having a full screen. And I can cover up. So remember how we had all the little side boxes of everybody and it would shrink down the screen and we couldn't see? Well, in the future, we can now do some really good screen sharing. I'm just really, really excited about that. And Dan, I think it's actually been it's the little expander button on the side window.
Oh, right. Mm-hmm,
I didn't I don't know. Sometimes I get stuck in my ways and I miss the opportunities in life. And this was one of those opportunities I've missed for 12 months. Everybody, make sure you're hitting that like button on YouTube. You know, we're averaging around 50 people, you know, every minute on this show on the YouTube feed only. And that's excluding Twitter. But I'm only seeing about 30 likes. And I know more people are liking this, but they're forgetting to hit the fucking button. So hit the button or we're going to cancel the show next week. That's all I got to say about that.
And that's what I call a cycle of retaliation.
Yeah. There's a contagion.
There's a grievance. We have a grievance cycle.
Yeah.
I don't think I need to model what happens when you take on the internet. I think that's a known.
You've got a very strong blush reflex, my friend. I'm just noticing this. You've got a blush. Yeah. You turn beetroot when you get slightly embarrassed.
I'm going to make myself look smaller now.
Yeah, we're very, very good move. There was actually an Australian tradition called shayaking, and I don't know how many people who were actually aware of it at all. But the idea was you'd be with a bunch of mates at school, and I'm talking when I was school age. You'd sit in a circle, sending each other up, trying to get somebody to blush. So you'd be a very easy target for a shayaking round.
Yeah. It's tough. It's tough being on this show. I'm surrounded by right now 4 intellectual individuals far above my skill set. So you know, he's
fishing again. No,
But he's just come in from the side, mate. But you've got the skill set.
And Ty, you have the second best hair. So
second best. Oh yeah, how could we? Let's just put that up there. Look at those locks. They're beautiful. Oh wait, hold on. There we go. Look at
I
that.
think there is
Hold
there
on?
is a
Did
way
you?
that you can challenge that though, Ty. You can in 2024 you could be on a pathway to a mullet, and you could do it if you wanted to.
I actually, in my teenage years, I had somewhat of something like that going. Not quite as. Now, did you go to like a hair designer for picture day there, Tim? Like, did you get like your
I actually
perm?
went to Midjourney. That's entirely AI created. So
Wow.
Wow, that is
Yeah, you
that is
gotta.
actually.
Tim has a distinctive look, like Marx and Einstein. All the great thinkers had that distinctive.
Hair,
When
yeah.
as soon as you see their headshot, you know who it is, right?
Yeah.
So
I
I
think
want to
it's
say something about the modeling, if I may. In some sense, stating the obvious, but notice how in system dynamics we're able to include important soft variables in our model. Everybody agrees, okay, the dollar goes here, then it goes here, then it goes here, the widget goes here, here, the person goes here. You can count them and whatever, but what about things like grievance or morale or adherence to an ideology or something like that? Well, we can handle that in system dynamics in a scientific manner, and to be quite honest with you, and then integrate it with the other stuff. And I don't think any other scientific tool really can do that very well.
Yeah. No, that's really good.
Yeah.
Tim, is there a reason why it's at a scale of 0.1 and then like what?
yeah, it gets into what Mike's talking about. So when you're modeling something like grievance, there's a couple tricks you can do because you want to one of the beauties and the challenges of system dynamics is based on calculus. So eventually the math has to work, right? So in that model, which was a fairly simple model, we used what are called 0 to 1 scales or 1 to -1 scales. And what that is looking at is saying we've defined grievance in a sort of a normative way over here in the text. We describe it qualitatively, but we aren't calculating a value of grievance. We're calculating a percentage of the population that holds that grievance. So then you can quantify very simply and say, in our models, there's 0%, that's a 0. No one holds a grievance. At 100%, everyone holds a grievance. And we do this again, that presentation on my YouTube of looking at the plenary, we model self-similarity, notoriety, coherence, these very vague terms of how people perceive others like them and we do it in this 0 to 1. You take a population, how many view themselves like the shooter? That's a self-similarity, and it can be between 0 and 1. You've quantified it without having to get a specific magnitude. Now you can do other tricks for a magnitude of grievance, right? And you could almost say at 1, your grievance so high, you're ready to kill yourself and everyone else. You would define that. It would be in your calculations. You'd say, this is what 1 means. At 0, you live and let live. You're neither for nor against. And at -1, you go out and actively reduce the grievance. You could identify that's a quantitative power of the grievance itself. Well, now combine the two, and you have a population that has the grievance and use a tracking stock or a CoFlow of the power of that grievance, and you're dealing in populations, you can now dynamically say what happens if the population goes up, but the strength of their grievance goes down. And again, these are you're sort of defining the equations, but you can then go out and look at it. We have data sets we use to identify what these values are in the population based off surveys and research by other people. So you can kind of spot check to make sure you're not crazy. But those are technical ways of dealing with these soft variables, and yet there should be understandable to your audience. You should be able to explain what do we mean, and they should go, oh yeah, 100% grievance, 1 grievance, that means everyone has it. Or they're so mad that they're willing to do this violent act.
I think that's actually Bob Liora is making a point against that, and I'm going to come on your side here, Tim. This is not like utility. This is you're trying to bring a attitudinal thing into a mathematical framework, and this is a qualitative margin. I'd say it's more like the sort of work not that neoclassicals do, which is all this utility maximizing bullshit, using indifference codes and crap like that. It's more like what von Neumann was trying to do with the theory of gains with Morgenstern, because he tried to say, look, the whole idea of subjective utility is nonsense. I want to work out a way of having a quantitative scale for utility. And in fact, that was completely misinterpreted by the neoclassicals. They stuffed it up and they combined the two together to get expected utility theory. But von Neumann worked out a way in which you could actually mathematically have a quantity you could call autile, and then talk about people having further substantial, it's not normative, it's ordinal versus cardinal. He
Right.
convert from an ordinal scale to a cardinal scale, and that was superior. It would have worked, and neoclassicals fucked it up and tied it into their whole bloody ordinal scheme once more without understanding what von Neumann was trying to achieve. But he was looking to go from an ordinal system to a cardinal and showed a way to do it. And in that sense, that's what you're doing as well.
And you should always back it back to something you can empirically measure. So we use a data source called the World Value Survey that goes out to 180 countries every 4 years and surveys everyone and sort of gets measurements of what we would call legitimacy. So when we model legitimacy in a model, we can spot check. Now they do it every 4 to 6 years, so it's like dots, but we can spot check and say the perceived legitimacy of the state Ukrainian government versus the Russian government by this segment of the Ukrainian population in 2014 was this. And then it shifted to this in 2018. And that's how we spot check our models and compare them. Likewise, on the mass shooting model, the radicalization model, we don't know, we can't go back and talk to these people who have killed themselves. They may be in jail. But as part of that presentation, I showed that our simulations were able to recreate the Columbine contagion from initial conditions, right? That means we have some ability to recreate from starting initial conditions to create a similar, very tricky pattern to recreate. You're talking only 76 incidents in 20 years. We also did it with the Virginia Tech contagion, which was only 6 incidents in 20 years. So you get some, and this is why we don't prove. We don't talk about validity. We talk about building confidence. We can say, look, we're not saying this is physics level right, although maybe they're not as right as they think sometimes. We're not trying to get physics envy, which I think is where
I don't know what you're dark mattering about there, but anyway.
Physics envy is where people get in trouble. They try and reduce the world to a simple equation. Even our simple models have 300 to 1,000 calculus equations in them. But then we go back and we do this testing and parameterization and confidence building to say, you can isolate something and say, do you agree with this or not? It's a key part of it.
Yeah, to jump in here, we don't use utility very much in system dynamics, although some people do, and properly used, it's okay. But we would more commonly use the concept of attractiveness or relative attractiveness. So for example, you might say for a market share model between Coke and Pepsi or iPhone and Android or whatever, you'd say, well, what are the things that would make your product more attractive? Well, relative price. My price is cheaper than the next person's. Relative functionality. I have more buttons I can push and whatever. Relative perceived quality. Mine is shinier, tougher, stronger, whatever. Relative delivery delay. I can have mine tomorrow. I got to wait 4 weeks to get the other one. And that makes the product A relatively more attractive than product B. And you can divide up 1,000 people want the thing, the soda or the phone or the whatever, and the market share divides, and you can fit the model to the price data, to the functionality, how many features does it have, to the market share, and whatever. But attractiveness is kind of like utility. It's some kind of perceived thing in somebody's head that in and of itself is a little mushy gushy, but we can use it to get us to where we want to go.
Silence.
Lots of
We're a bit talked out, I think, by the sounds of that.
I can hit some more
back
questions if there's interest on the feed.
Actually, there is here. I'll bring it up. I don't know if Michael's trolling me here or trying to troll you, Tim, but I'll bring up his question. I don't know what he was.
I saw this is actually the one I were hoping because I saw it.
Okay, so the question is, what type of therapy should be applied, and to what scale to solve this grievance problem? Expand on that, Tim.
Yeah, so when he originally asked it, he had a list of like cognitive behavioral therapies that we commonly use. So this is a question that gets into de-radicalization and system level interventions to cut this feedback loop. First of all, most of the things you're talking about are not designed for this level of violent radicalization. If I can do a pitch, the Counter Extremism Project last week held a day-long conference in DC. The videos are online where they focused on how do you rehabilitate and de-radicalize someone like an ISIS fighter, someone like an Al-Qaeda operative, someone like a violent white supremacist who just got out of prison. And that is itself its own field of carefully construed ethics. How do you de-radicalize? But it has to do with removing that, getting them out of that identity, that activated identity, giving them a different narrative for the grievance and beginning to shift away. And often it requires you to be close to their frame. Someone like me is not going to be successful at de-radicalizing an Al-Qaeda operative because we see the world in such different ways. I'm not near his frame. You need intermediaries that are close to the frame. But with system dynamics, so these are all the sort of individual tactics and strategies that are out there. But with system dynamics, we can find interventions at the level of the system that are very novel and sort of, I hate to keep pitching. If you go back to that video on my YouTube of the plenary, we talk about system level interventions where you're intervening at the level of the cultural scripts that are passing this information around. And you get, for example, counter reification is an asymmetric strategy that confuses an idea so it's no longer easily understood. And you no longer can understand what it is about, say, a particular terror contagion that's attractive. You use counter reification, so it's sort of like throwing chaff in the air. There's obfuscation, which reduces the coherence. So even if they see it, they can't understand what to do. They can't follow the template. There is failure abandonment. Like a big one, notoriety was that pitch. The people tend to like notorious things, like, oh, that guy's a rebel or an outlaw. He's, it's mysterious. It's Hollywood. Failure notoriety is when you advertise the people who don't succeed, the one who gets stopped by his principal and ends up in jail or crying on a stand somewhere because he's ruined his life, the guy who gets shot before he gets in the courthouse of Dallas. Failure notoriety is a counteractive to say, this isn't the fantasy, that identity fantasy you have in your head that you're going to be the heroic resistance fighter or you're going to be the heroic violent person who makes this change. It's not going to work out that way. You're going to hurt your family. You're going to hurt your friends. All of these strategies now, the purpose of the simulation isn't to come up with them. It's to test them in an environment where we can build consensus among experts. You have a psychologist, you have an economist, you have a de-radicalization specialist. They all come to the table and we say, here's a good simulation. Let's now test what works and doesn't work, or what combination of things we need to use at what sequence. That's really where the simulations come in handy for that kind of discussion.
And I think actually, given what we're talking about here with Hamas versus Israel, the Palestinians versus Israel, unfortunately, or Israel versus the Palestinians, I think I would see the Marshall Plan after the Second World War as you want to rebuild the productive capacity rather than destroying it. If we look at the First World War, the attitude of the winners was to wipe out Germany, but particularly the attitude of the French. And as Keynes said, that's what would lead to another world war, which indeed is what happened. Whereas the Marshall Plan said we have to rebuild the productive capacity of Germany, and we have to give Germany a reason to be invested in the prosperity of Europe. And that worked a treat until the Austerians took over again. But it's certainly, the Marshall Plan versus the Treaty of Versailles. I know which one worked.
So we got a question here from Danger Zone. Maybe Tim or Mike would know, but has the World War II Holocaust been modeled yet? And obviously from a system dynamic perspective.
I don't know of one. I know the model, the emerging state actor model, is designed to model atrocities and ethnic cleansing, but that level, because it's dealing at a different scale, it's not, I don't know if it's that particular case study. I don't know if it'd be able to model. I mean, it is being looked at by people who study and monitor atrocities as a monitoring tool, but the Holocaust was a conventionally applied genocide from a state-based actor with full authority and top-down industrial control. So, I mean, this is a very specific set of circumstances, but there's also the Uyghur genocide occurring in China right now. You've got other genocides. So I think there could be space for a model of genocides as a way of looking at that and distinguishing them from ethnic cleansing or war crimes or atrocities. I mean, it's not that any of these are better than the other. They kind of go up a scale that starts at really bad, but I don't know of any particular models, Mike, if you know of, jump in, that model the Holocaust from a system dynamics perspective.
Yeah. No, I don't know any that have addressed that particular problem. What was leaping to mind, like the closest thing I can come up with on the fly here, is there is a model that was done about the forces leading up to World War II, and you can run the model and try and stop World War II from happening. That's obviously not the Holocaust. The other one, again, leaping to mind, that's kind of sort of in the ballpark. Two Israeli system dynamicists some years ago built a system dynamics model of charismatic leaders. And obviously everything from Jesus to Hitler, is going to be in that sandbox. But it was quite an interesting model, is how do charismatic leaders emerge and what have you. And that can lead, I suppose, to the Holocaust. But nothing directly. But yeah, I mean, all these things can be modeled, believe it or not. I think it hasn't been modeled because some people have thought it can't be modeled. But Tim is showing us that it can.
Tim, buddy, it was great. You spent another Saturday. You put yourself in the hot seat on a divisive. You know what? Going through all the comments, you were well received. I think there is an ability for people to have an intellectual conversation on such touchy subjects like what's going on in the Middle East right now. So I am really appreciative of joining us and giving your insights. Remember, everybody, you can find Tim on Twitter at @infomullet. You can ask him for that paper. You don't have to do it discreetly. You can be wide open, put exclamation marks, explodey faces, all the emojis and stuff, and he'll give you a copy of the paper. I think it might be worthwhile to really check that out. I want to do we can do that. Let's do it. Steve has something very important to say. Steve, go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, look, sorry to squeeze in here, Tim. I'm just, you may know that I started running a set of courses after a marketing company approached me last year to put on a set of lectures as a way of raising money. It worked, but it hit saturation, all sorts of hassles on how they market it as well. But what's finally happened over about a year of working with them, I'm finally putting together the courses I want to run, which are a set of courses effectively for students of economics right now who are learning neoclassical economics, to give them an antidote to it. And that is now, we're going to start on Wednesday of next week. It'll be Wednesday at 1 o'clock New York time. And Ty, if you can actually whack this link up, this is the link to actually sign up. And I'll put two more as well from my Patreon. We've got a Patreon here. I'll go Substack, actually, because it may be more accessible. So this is to see a bit about the course. The sign-up cost is going to be $9, and if you want to hang around, it's $49 a month. And it's a very, very non-neoclassical course. And I give examples of. On Twitter, I've given examples of the three of the lectures that I'm putting together. They're 15 to 25 minute lectures, quite brief, 1 hour long session every Wednesday. And I'm certainly speaking for my people who are in the longer course and the more expensive course, which costs $500 a year. It's been very popular with them, and I think you'll find this very worthwhile lectures. So anybody who's curious about my approach to economics, which blends system dynamics with chaos theory and a particular approach to classical economics, the role of energy, and so on, sign up to the course, and I think you'll enjoy the lectures. End of that.
Steve, it's not even advertising because it's your show, so it's really just you talking. It's just you talking, and that's great. So I've put the links in the chat, so you can just all the chatters there. You can click on it, check it out, and anybody who's watching this later, well, the link's right there underneath everybody's pretty faces and that fancy hair of Tim's. Steve, you have a little bit less, at least on
a little bit less.
The backside.
Steve used to have the big hair.
I had the afro when I was in my 20s. I had a literal afro, which I'd like to check and see what the genetic history is there. I hope it involves something non-Caucasian in my background. But yeah. But I'm afraid the older my hair got, the less elasticity it had. And I never tried the long locks there. But when I had long hair at one stage, and this is actually for the interview with Lex Friedman, people were saying I looked like the sparrow from the Game of Thrones. So I deliberately keep my hair short these days if I can possibly manage it.
And I wish I actually created a logo comparing both Steve's picture and the sparrow's picture. I don't think I have it anymore. I'd put it up. It was quite entertaining for me to do that. Anyways, that is the show. We've got Ann Pettifor next week. It should be really exciting. Tim, once again, thank you. We'll have you back in the new year, or we'll have you back in an emergency episode the next time.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Oh, it's great.
Good,
You
yeah.
are a super insightful guy, and I don't hesitate to have people that have a background in system dynamics on the show at any time. So that was great. Anyways, until next week, for Steve, Mike, Dan, and Tim, bye-bye.